who is known by everyone and who is part of our research project. He's professor at the Université Grenoble-Alpes, and he was the person who proposed the name of Tom Buchanan to be here today, because he has his works, and he usually mentioned the Tom Buchanan words on his book, Ni una ni grande ni libre. So thanks to his book, for example, I could know the works of Tom Buchanan. And regarding Tom Buchanan, he's professor of modern and European history at the University of Oxford. And his work focuses on 20th century British and European history, with a special interest in three main areas. China and the British left, a topic which he deals with in his book, East Wind, China and the British Left, 1925-1976. He is also interested in the impact of the Spanish Civil War on British politics, going beyond the 30s and dealing with some solidarity networks in favor of Spaniards and anti-Francoist Spaniards under Francoism. And this is quite close related to the topic that he's going to speak about today, the history of Amnesty International and human rights campaigning in Britain, which is the topic that he deals in his book, the book that he is going to present today, Amnesty International and Human Rights Activism in Postwar Britain, 1945 to 1977. So thank you, both of you, for being here this afternoon. And of course, thanks to all the attendees. The floor is yours, Tom. And regarding the seminar, Tom will speak about 20-25 minutes with the main ideas of his book, and then Nicolás will comment the book and the things that he considered. And after that, you will start a dialogue between you, and then the last 30-40 minutes we will leave a piece of time to other questions, to other people. So, as I said before, the floor is yours, Tom. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so, well, first of all, thanks to Daniel for that kind introduction, and to Carlos for inviting me. I think we first met in Oxford, so it's very nice to see you again, at least virtually. And I gather to Nicolás for suggesting my name and my book. So it's very good for you to invite me to take part in this online seminar and to give me an opportunity to discuss my book on human rights activism. Throughout my career, the Spanish Civil War has really been central to my research interests, and my book on China and the British left, which Daniel just mentioned, started off as a comparative study of the British response to the kind of conflicts of the 1930s. So it was meant to be a kind of companion to the work I'd done on the Spanish Civil War. It kind of got a bit out of control and ended up covering a much larger period. But that was where that started. And my work on Amnesty also had its roots in Spain, because it started with a paper that I was asked to give in the mid-90s about British attitudes to Franco's Spain in the 1950s and the early 60s. And really that's what got me interested, because I kept on coming across these organizations called Amnesty, and I began to realize that there was more than one Amnesty and that they stood for different things. And to some extent they were, contesting the title of Amnesty. So that kind of, as a historian, I suppose that's the kind of thing that gets you interested. I hadn't had any prior experience of Amnesty. I was never a member of it, or hadn't taken part in Amnesty activities. So I was kind of learning about Amnesty at the same time. So that sort of simple observation that the word amnesty was very much part of the anti-Franco movement in Britain, but also something that was being contested by different groups, was the initial observation that began and developed, as were very slowly, into the origins of the book. But I think it is worth making the point that right from my PhD onwards, so I did my, well, we call it DPhil in Oxford, PhD. I did that in the mid-80s, and right from that point onwards, I've always been interested in, you might say, kind of non-state organizations. So my PhD was about the British trade union movement and how it was involved in the Spanish Civil War. And I've always been interested after that in, religious groups, voluntary organizations, humanitarian organizations, and the questions such as, why are they created in the first place? Who takes part in them? And perhaps above all, how do they engage with international challenges? I think that's been the kind of theme that's run through all of the topics that I've studied over the years. Okay, so this interest turned into the book about Amnesty. The project did take a very long time to come to fruition, because I started to think about the subject in the mid-90s, and the book was finally published 25 years later. So I hasten to say that's not due to laziness on my part, because it's really because of the way the project unfolded as a kind of, really as a side interest to other things that I was already committed to doing. So I was committed to write a textbook on post-war Europe, which took quite a lot of my time in the early 2000s and so on. So I only worked on it full time from 2012 onwards. So that's a bit more respectable in terms of the amount of years we're talking about. But also by the early 2000s, I had already published 2 articles which dealt with at least part of the history of Amnesty and sort of tackled the 2 questions that I was particularly interested in. One of those questions was, why did Amnesty start? Why did it begin? And also, why did it start when it did in 1961? It's interesting, when I talk about Amnesty and its history, people almost always ask me, when did it begin? I'm looking for some kind of hook to hang it from. People are interested in that, and they don't know, which again, I find interesting. But the second big question was, why did Amnesty go through this massive internal crisis in the mid-1960s? A crisis so severe that Amnesty may have, been destroyed by that crisis. And its founder, Peter Benenson, I'll talk about a bit more later on, was forced to leave the organization. So a very damaging moment, which fortunately for Amnesty, it did recover from. So having answered these questions as fully as possible with those articles, then people were often asking me, well, are you going to go on and write a complete history of Amnesty? And that didn't really hold a particular appeal for me. I mean, I find organizational histories are not terribly exciting. But what I did find appealing was the idea of placing the story of Amnesty at the center of a bigger story about the emergence of what we can loosely call human rights activism in modern Britain. And that approach was consistent with the kind of research that I've always done. As I mentioned, I tend to be interested in organizations and the people involved in them. And the way that you have these multiple organizations, some of them more effective than others, some of them more successful. And then you have these networks that sustain them based on politics and religion and humanitarian ideas and so on. So really, for some years prior to 2012, when I started working on this in earnest, I did have a clear idea in my mind of the kind of book that I would like to write, and the kind of book I thought would be worthwhile. And so I hope, at least if nothing else, that readers feel the book, that was the book I delivered, that's where I got to at the end. So in many ways, this long period of gestation was actually very helpful, because during these years, many new archives became available. So things like the MI5 intelligence surveillance files at the National Archives, which actually are very interesting for understanding the lives of activists, and have to be treated with some suspicion, but they are often a source of very interesting information. Also, a lot of the Amnesty archives or new archives continued to be made available, and eventually they were transferred from the London headquarters to the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. But I looked at them in London. I later went to Amsterdam because I wanted to see if anything else had come in. But I looked at them in the London HQ. But just as importantly, the scholarly field had been transformed by a whole slew of literature on the history of human rights, the best known of which, of course, is Sam Moyn's remarkably influential book, The Last Utopia, published in 2010. And I must pay tribute to Sam Moyn, not only for his scholarly leadership in the field, but also for the interest that he showed in my work, and ultimately his willingness to include my book in his excellent Cambridge University Press series, which is where it appeared. I mean, being able to participate in this new field was tremendously helpful, although I did make clear at the very start of the book, I think at the very first page, that, you know, if this topic is called human rights activism, I'm fundamentally more interested in the activism than in, you might say, in the human rights part of that equation. That, you know, I think the human rights conception is more problematic, but activism is really what I work on. I'm very much an archive historian. Once I'd committed to writing the book, I began to realize what a lot of work I still had to cover on the ground. And if you look at the bibliography, you know, you'll see there is a very wide range of archives that I looked at. I was really sort of chasing down all of these organizations as far as possible and these kinds of connections. Each of those archives taught me something, although as others will know, it's often not what you're expecting to find, it's what you're not expecting to find that's really exciting. It was particularly interesting to discover some papers in Rhodes House, which is a library in Oxford, the papers of a radical clergyman called the Reverend Michael Scott were there. And these were papers at that time, you know, barely catalogued, which makes them particularly intriguing, you know, and I was going through this material. He was a very interesting guy who had taken up the cause of modern Namibia in the late 1940s and had gone to the UN and really became very involved in that sort of international world of, you might say, human rights diplomacy, I suppose we might say nowadays. And he was pursuing causes of social justice, racial justice, and so on. And these very loosely catalogued papers were a kind of goldmine for that kind of study. So that was an incredibly helpful discovery at the start, really, that there was this load of material there. Not least because it opened my eyes to the influence of Michael Scott's close friend, which was the very wealthy newspaper proprietor, David Astor, the son of the first woman MP, Nancy Astor, and so on. I mean, he's really one of the great unsung heroes of modern British history, and a really interesting model of, you know, how to put inherited wealth to the best possible use. And the list of things that he supported, you know, organizations and causes is remarkable. And that was really, you know, he was very prominent in that archive. The Scott papers are just, you know, on a personal note, they're also very interesting to me because my parents had both been involved in the 1950s in that Christian socialist milieu. And it was very interesting talking to them about this, and they knew a lot of the people that featured in Scott's papers, and indeed had met Scott himself on the island of Iona in Scotland, which is a kind of, again, a sort of Christian socialist retreat in the distant Hebrides. So there was kind of personal interest for me as well. Anyway, as I've mentioned, I had a good sense of the shape of the book right from the beginning. So defining where to start and to stop wasn't a major problem. I decided this was not going to be a book, you know, about the 1930s or the 1980s. I mean, they didn't fit in terms of the world of politics of those periods. So the dates I chose were not just symbolic, but the late 70s the Nobel Prize that Amnesty received in 1977, I thought made good sense. One conceptual issue that I had to take very seriously was this question of whether contemporary historians are imposing this idea of human rights activism on the events of the past. so when we talk about human rights activism or the human rights movement, we are using a modern concept that isn't necessarily existing in the past. And I think that's clearly something that we have to take seriously. There's no doubt that people like Michael Scott would not have thought of themselves at the time as a human rights activist or whatever. However, it also became clear to me that what we were looking at, the period I was studying, was a period of transition, and people were kind of, you might say, reinventing themselves, and that's really what I was looking at. And so that was why I was so interested in one topic I gave a whole chapter to, was the UN Year of Human Rights in 1968, because during that year we can see people who perhaps have been identified with some other concept or some other identity taking on this mantle of human rights because they saw some value in that, either because they liked the idea or because they saw it as a way of getting funding or getting higher status or something like that. And so in the book, I decided to get around this problem, as it were, by using the term that was used at the time, which is this phrase called the field of human rights. And that's how people saw it at the time, that there were these various organizations loosely kind of doing the same thing, but in a very broadly defined area. There was kind of looseness and opportunity of that period, which I was trying to convey. It wasn't a time when being involved in these struggles was a kind of, was a job or a career or something like that. It was a place where you could pursue your own interests and feel you were doing something worthwhile. So the book starts with the Second World War and the popularization of thinking about human rights, especially with the UN Charter, and then above all the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And what I was interested in there was how the activists saw this new language and these new mechanisms as a way in which they could intervene in national and international politics. So the story is quite uneven in the 1940s. And really what the book argues is that eventually this adoption of interest in human rights was worked out not in sort of theoretical terms, but rather in a very practical response to the wider struggles of the 1950s, decolonization, anti-apartheid, which was tremendously important, aspects of the resistance to communist rule in Eastern Europe, and also the resistance to the European dictatorships such as Spain and Portugal. And this was the background for the emergence of the British lawyer Peter Benenson, whose many initiatives dominate the central part of the book, culminating in the launching of Amnesty, initially as a year-long project in May of 1961. And the launch and this remarkable success of Amnesty was really, I think, transformative. And the final two chapters of the book look at the emerging world of human rights activism, a world and a discourse that was really shaped by Amnesty's success. So organizations set up after Amnesty were created constantly looking at Amnesty and looking over their shoulder. What had Amnesty done? How were we similar to Amnesty? Were we different from it? That was really the kind of questions they were dealing with. It's worth pointing out that originally my plan was to deal with the 70s really in a single chapter, but that proved impossible, partly because of I think I probably underestimated the importance of debates around torture and campaigns around torture, and I ended up putting all of that in a separate chapter. So that's the only way really in which the book changed between my original plan and the published version. And the book ends in 1977, and I suppose unintentionally, of course, 77 was when the Nobel Prize was awarded, but 78, the following year, was when the Helsinki Watch organization was set up, and that was the basis for Human Rights Watch, and that really became, you might say, a very different modus operandi to Amnesty, and something of a rival in the years after. So I think, again, that's quite a good sort of end point for me. I must say something about Peter Benenson, who was Amnesty's founder, and he was the the charismatic pioneer around whom really so much revolved in terms of the material I was covering. Soon after I first got interested in Amnesty, this was in 1997, I found that Benenson was living close to Oxford at that time, and I invited him for lunch at my department. And I had a contact through a friend who had worked for Amnesty, Tricia Feeney, who had been involved in some of the early Amnesty missions abroad, notably to Argentina in the mid-70s. And through these contacts, I was able to get in touch with Benenson, and so that's the only time I met him. Now, by the time I met him, he wasn't in great health, and with hindsight, I can see that what he told me was a story about Amnesty's foundation that he must have told many times before. But at some point in that conversation, he asked me what I studied. And when I said the Spanish Civil War, it was really quite dramatic. He became very animated, and he immediately said, yeah, the Spanish Civil War, that's it. That's where it all started. So I thought it was very interesting. And I think there were two things that he meant by that. One was that he, when he was at school, he was at Eton, a very famous British public school. He had been involved in the support of the Spanish Republic, and in particular, the adoption of various child refugees, financially adopting them, as it were. But also, I think he was talking about his whole generation, for whom the Spanish Civil War, was a very important part of their whole, kind of intellectual and political formation. So I thought that was interesting. And soon after that, I did get access to the Amnesty archives. I don't know if there's any connection or not, but it's nice to think that that had helped in some way. After Benenson's death in 2005, I got to know his daughter, and through her, I gained access to Benenson's private papers. And again, that was tremendously helpful, and I was very grateful for that, because that helped me to deal with his personality I think in a richer and perhaps a deeper way. I mean, some people I know are uncomfortable with the concept of genius, but I think there was an element of genius about Benenson, although there were many critics of what he did and how he operated. But in terms of what he achieved, I mean, it was really remarkable. He started an organization really from nothing, just with an idea, and launched it both nationally and internationally, and made it a success. And compared to so many organizations that fail, I think that really is, there's an element of genius to all of that. If I was asked a self-indulgent question about what where I went next, how I developed it, I think that the answer would be that I don't have any plans to do a follow-up volume. I don't want to take the story any further. For me, as far as I'm concerned, that story is finished, and it'll be another story to go a step further. As I said in the epigraph to the book, the best part of the day is the dawn, and I think for me that's what this story is about. It's the dawn of something, the start of something new, something I found very interesting. I am still writing on Amnesty, so I published something in a collection on the Greek crisis for the late 1960s quite recently. But since then, I've been going back to the Spanish Civil War, which is I suppose my most long-term abiding interest. And my next big project is on the formative years of the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. This breaks my rule, actually, as Wilson was not at all interested in the Spanish Civil War. But he featured prominently in my books on both China and Amnesty. He was a frequent visitor to China in the late 50s and the early 60s. And he was probably the most senior British politician to really understand how important an impact human rights would have over on the politics of the 1960s. One concluding thought is that the book deals with a time in which activism really could make a difference, and I think really did make a difference. When one thinks about the impact of organizations like Amnesty in the years of their existence, and I think it'd be hard to gainsay that. The book ends with human rights poised to make a far greater impact on the world stage in the 1980s and 90s, especially following the end of the Cold War. At the same time, the human rights movement, as we can now properly refer to it, I think, in the 1990s, became embedded in the international structures of the international order, in the UN, the Council of Europe, so many other international bodies. And power kind of passed from activists to lawyers and professional people. Now, that time and those aspirations, the 1990s, now seem really quite remote. In recent years, Amnesty has actually been banned in a number of states, most notably in Russia and India. And the rollback of human rights across the world proceeds apace, and I hardly need to labour the point. You know, legal defences are shown to be far less resilient than was once assumed. So I suppose the final thing to say is that the book describes the start of a story, but it sometimes seems the wheel has come full circle and the ball is back once more in the activist court, and to give strength to the the legal advances of recent years, we need to perhaps go back to the kind of impact that these sort of activist organizations historically have had. Anyway, I hope that's an interesting starting point. I'm very happy to hear what others have to say, and what I think Nicholas is going to say something, isn't he?
Yes, thanks very much, Tom. And although it says on the computer that I'm Carlos Domper, I'm Nicolás Sesma, but this kind of transfiguration between Carlos and I, and it happens quite oftenly. So yeah, I'm just taking his computer for starting the session. But anyway, it is just a luxury to having you with us and having your presentation in our seminar. So I will start, of course, by thank you for being here, and thank you as well for putting Spanish history into a much global context in all your research and in all your works. You're not the only one who's finishing your book took ages, because finishing my PhD took ages to me. And one of your articles about how different was Spain later Franco regime was published in the book coordinated by Nigel Thompson. It was much helpful for me and for finishing my PhD and having a more concrete idea of how different was Spain and Franco regime compared in this international context. And I have to mention as well the book you coordinated together with Martin Conway about political Catholicism in Europe. And it was a very interesting chapter about Spain. If I'm not wrong, it was Mary Beeson who did that. And I was very glad that Spain was already integrated into a much broader European perspective. And you were really pioneers in this sense. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with this seminar, just putting Spanish history into a much more broader picture than it happened till the very late of the 1990s. And one more remark, and more related to your book. Thanks to you and to Martin Conway, I think the world that we thought was created in 1945, thanks to your research and Martin Conway's research, it was indeed much more a war of the 1960s and the 1970s than we thought. It was much more a creation of the mobilization of activism of the 60s and 70s than a creation of the post-war institutions like like United Nations. And because we have the tendency of believing that the NGOs were much. Indeed, the frame was created by the United Nations and the Charter of 1945, but it wasn't until the 60s that the real NGO world, as we know today, it was developed and created. So thanks very much for your works in general. And starting with my my comments, I mean, it's a very sophisticated way of doing institutional history, as you were saying of it. Doing the history of our organization can be very arise if you just focus on the internal issues. But it's I think you just took Amnesty to provide us a global picture of what the 70s and the 60s and the 70s look like, and in that sense, it was Mark Bloch who said that we're more children of our age than children of our parents, and I think that's exactly the case for what regards activism in the 60s and in the 70s. I was particularly happy to see the references to films. For example, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was so influential in the generation of our parents. And just as a personal anecdote, myself and my wife, we became both members of International Amnesty after watching a film, after watching Papillon. And regardless of the crimes, if any, of the prisoners at that time, the conditions of detention were unacceptable, and so that provides a whole picture of how far cultural products also influence generations, and we're children of a legacy, but children of a time, and I think that is perfectly represented on the book. So what I'm going to try to do is just pointing out some questions regarding, in general, in the field of activism and the field of NGOs, and the big debates concerning not only international Amnesty International, but every NGO has to face the same questions. And so, taking your case study as an example, we will provide a 3-4 general questions, and we would like to hear your comments about that. But just one first point, it was about in the very first part of your book, you talk about the inspiration and the antecedents of Amnesty International. And of course, you mentioned not just the British cases, like the fight against slavery, which is in Britain and in British history is so important. You mentioned as well the Sacco and Vanzetti case. You mentioned even the Ferrer-Guardia case, which was so important for the appearance of this notion of the intellectual. But how about the Dreyfus affair? Did you ever consider to introduce this case as one of the sources of inspiration for Amnesty International? Because it involves, again, this the writer becoming an intellectual, going into the public sphere, and also figures, profiles that then appears very much in your book, like for example, this question of Jewishness, like Dreyfus, who was Jew himself, even if it was more like a non-Jewish Jew, that a proper religious person, and how the campaign for getting his freedom, it goes beyond what the fields of the little bourgeoisie of the Jewish sphere, integrating the socialist movement and making also the socialist movement going beyond their own frontiers to escape from just one working class discourse, going to a more, I would not say human rights, but I would say the field of human rights, as you mentioned, as a way of understanding human rights in a much more broader sense. So that would be just one comment. If you ever consider the Dreyfus affair, and how was because there were also observers coming from Britain to both processes, to Alfred Dreyfus, and how was the legacy of the Dreyfus affair in the Anglo-Saxon sphere valued and considered nowadays? My second point we'll consider is more about, and you mentioned the importance of Peter Benenson himself for the foundation and for the growing of Amnesty International. I think this is one of the first tensions that every NGO organization has to deal, the tension between personal leadership and collective action. In a way, in your conclusions, you say that the creation of Amnesty International is it reflects how we transfer from private conscience to war law. But my question will be, how is more going from private conscience to a private kind of action, but through public opinion? How is this type of NGOs are dependent of having one person with charisma, having a strong leadership. So when we're talking about public action and collective action, we're in reality talking about another way of doing private action. It was because when we talk about association, about civil society, we tend to forget as well that every organization needs very charismatic people. So this tension between personal leadership and collective action. And I was thinking about the memoirs of Stefan Zweig when he speaks about how to help one political prisoner who was in Italy, in fascist Italy at that time, and he in his memoirs he explained how he approached personally Mussolini in order to have a private conversation with him, and he says that it was a much more effective way of acting than getting into a public opinion campaign, because once you get into a public opinion campaign, the state feels challenged by the public opinion of other countries, and for national reasons you cannot release that prisoner. So and Zweig always talk about this more 19th century world, about having more a couloir type of policy. So was that changed by the in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and with the appearance in a much more nowadays sense of public opinion and how public opinion functions, or is just another way of doing the same kind of elite policy by other means? So this that would be my first question, this tension between personal leadership and collective action. The second one has to do with this, and you evoke it in your presentation as well, the relationship between human rights organizations and the state. It was one of the reasons of this big crisis that you mentioned in Amnesty International. So do human rights organizations has to accept the state funding or not? And to what end and to what extent do they have to accept state funding, or even a state influence into the functioning and into the ways of these organizations act in another country? Because I was thinking, to what extent NGOs, and particularly NGOs who are very national identify, I would say Amnesty International exists in almost every country, but is still a very British type of organization. So to what extent a state, knowing that, uses these kind of organizations to do what the states cannot do? So it's just another way of what the states operates in a foreign sphere. Like, for example, religious orders in the past, like religious orders were held by the Spanish and the Portuguese states to go beyond their own fields of action. So to what extent these organizations can be used by state in exchange of funding for doing much more state foreign policies than their own policies of the organization? And again, to what extent this creates an internal tension in the organizations themselves? And as I mentioned before, we have these very charismatic figures that have dealt with the debate, as you mentioned in your book, for example, the case of Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist who was one of the promoters of UNESCO. And Yehudi Menuhin also in his memoir says it doesn't matter where the funds come from. What is important is the final end. So the greater good outweighs ethical or political concerns. I'd like to hear more your comments about this this question that is a question who goes us through every type of human rights organization. Another point will be about the Spanish Civil War. You mentioned this fantastic phrase about Peter Benenson that you mentioned in your introduction. I would recommend everyone at the seminar who go see that phrase. The Spanish Civil War is where it all started. That reminds me very much the people I was talking to in the United States. For example, Robert Paxton always says that the Spanish Civil War was kind of the founder event, the founder event of his political conscience. So to what extent every audience needs this kind of super event in order to become engaged in politics, in order to become an activist, and to what extent the audience always need some previously possessed knowledge through family ties, to local engagement, to what extent we're just the product of what we've seen and the product of an heritage, and there's no way in which we're going to be interested in a freshly new country that we never heard about, because it's more or less the same with China. There's and as I'm hoping to take a look at your new research, but I got the impression that exactly the same communities and the same countries that were interested in China in the 1920s and 30s are nowadays the biggest expert on what is going on in China, and it happens the same with the Spanish Civil War, and a broader comment about how important was the Spanish Civil War. And as you mentioned, Amnesty International was trying to appeal to a younger generation under 45, but it was this appealing of the Spanish case. We got some ebooks of the past that made Amnesty International campaign for political prisoners work so well, and allows the organization to develop and become a much more global institution. I was particularly interested by the abuse of psychiatry, the chapter in this chapter in dealing with the campaign against torture, and again it evokes notably some recent films that just appear. For example, this Lettonian TV show that became extremely popular in Occidental Europe, Soviet Jeans, about one just guy who are just black marketing with some Western products like jeans or Coca-Cola, and he's arrested by the communist authorities, and he's put in a mental institution. This abuse of mental institution as a way of repressing precisely the political dissidents, which became a very popular way of acting in the Soviet Union. So I would like to hear some comments about the relationship between medicine and psychological professions and activism, because it's by no way anodyne that we found also in the guerrillas, for example, in Latin America, a high amount of medical nurses, psychiatrists. So is there any particular link between the medical professions and activism? And to what extent is again one of the consequences of this film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? And related to that, you asked yourself a question in this chapter of your book. Did it matter what crime, if any, the victim had committed to deserve this kind of treatment, this kind of being called mad or whatever? So I was thinking, what's our understanding of being a victim but being a perpetrator at the same time? What should it be our approach to this kind of profiles, to this kind of figures? And thinking about in particular to the Spanish case, what should be, for example, our understanding or memory or public remembrance of a person like Carrero Blanco, who was a perpetrator, but who was a victim of a terrorist attack at the same time. And this is a question that it's particularly sensitive in Spain nowadays, concerning, for example, Basque terrorists, former members of the ETA. And again, the campaigns of Amnesty International were very polemic in Spain, because they were dealing with this kind of members of the ETA that were perpetrators and victims of torture and victims of political repression at the same time. How do we deal with these profiles that they're not black and white figures, but the more gray in all sense of the term? And last but not least, and for not taking all the time of the debate, and probably a question you've never been asked, particularly in recent times: what's the future of human rights? Because as you mentioned at the end of your book, in your conclusions, we're probably thinking in the 1990s that we were going into a more global understanding of human rights and about the international code of law, and we thought that international law was going to reshape how we deal with international criminals and with dictators, etc. And what we are actually, unfortunately, facing today is what is happening in not only in Gaza, but again, as a kind of defashionation, if I'm allowed to put it that way, of human rights in general. Like if you're taking care of human rights in an international sphere, it's because you're dismissing your internal affairs, and it's a much more attack on activists that only as if they were only concerned about international problems and not about their own inner problems in their own societies. So that made me think about this Hannah Arendt phrase in Eichmann in Jerusalem, when they say human rights is just appeal for those who are too weak to appeal to their own rights as citizens. It's much more effective to apply to your rights as British or as French or as Spanish citizen than appealing to human rights just in general. And she was talking about the Israeli case, and it's kind of prophetic considering what is happening nowadays, that now the Israelis people know they don't have to appeal to human rights anymore, because now they have a state, and so they can appeal to the right as citizens and not the right as persons of the earth, as human rights in general. And that it's also there's a much very last question: what's your understanding of Philip Sand's conception as human rights as just not a very effective tool, but a tool that will always be there to remind dictators that they will never be they can never be relaxed again, that it will always be a weapon that in any time, at any moment, they can bring society against them and against their impunity and the impunity culture in general. So that will be just that will be all. Thanks very much.
Okay. So yeah, okay, thanks very much indeed. That's a lot of very interesting questions there to think about. Yeah, the Dreyfus affair, I'm afraid I have to say, it's not something that was on my radar in the same way, perhaps because it didn't have such a big impact in Britain. It's not sort of thought of in quite the same way compared to, I mean, actually something that did have a big effect that I didn't look at was the tragic week in Barcelona, and the executions after that. And that, that was perhaps a more immediate impact of something, fairly close by. But yeah, I've not come across anything with linking it directly with Dreyfus. I can see certainly the connection is absolutely makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the question about leadership and charisma is really interesting, and I think, I mean, for me, having worked in this sort of area for quite a long time, I'm always struck the way this just comes around again and again. And it's very hard actually when talking about NGOs or voluntary organizations to find organizations that weren't set up by someone having this kind of very powerful idea, a very powerful drive. There are a few exceptions. I suppose one would be, something like Oxfam, which was set up literally as the Oxford Famine Relief Committee, and that's a very kind of neutral way. And there isn't, I don't know, I'm not so familiar with that story, but I'm not aware of there being a single, person having this sort of bright idea. But that's something of an exception, because typically there is someone who has this sort of insight and then kind of really runs with it and sort of takes other people with them. And then almost inevitably that person then, ultimately sort of falls out with the organization, because I think what we have is an inevitable, if that movement survives, it reaches another level, which is an organizational level, where that person is unable to operate effectively. And the case of Benenson, I think, is really quite tragic. Because, when I started looking at those archives that I mentioned, the very first thing that I found in the cupboard was these beautifully bound volumes of oral history interviews with about 20 or 25 people who've been involved since the foundation of Amnesty. And most of these volumes, they only went as far as 1966 or 7. And there was a kind of agreement really not to venture into that area, because they all had such admiration for Peter Benenson. They didn't want to say anything that would in any way undermine his, especially as long as he was still alive. And often they have little riders saying, this section not to be published, not to be made public as long as Peter Benenson's alive, or simply never to be made public. So it's interesting how, how traumatized the organization was by having to kind of release Peter Benenson and wave him goodbye. And in fact, he did return later on. So these things can be very powerful and can be quite damaging, I think.
Yeah, is it more or less the same what happened to Bernard Kouchner, who was the founder of Doctors Without Borders? It's kind of exactly the same figure.
That's right. And I think even all the way back, to the Red Cross and all of these organizations, there's definitely a pattern there. In terms of, the wider question you were raising about how that relates to, whether you move from kind of private action to something collective. I think that was the problem that Amnesty faced, because when Amnesty was set up, it's interesting that the thing that kind of we all kind of remembered about Amnesty was all these people in groups writing letters to try and get people out of jail. But actually that wasn't part of the original conception. I was very surprised when I found that. I was going through all the documents and I couldn't find that. And I realized that basically it wasn't clear there would be a response. And when there was, they had to do something with it. People were getting very agitated, we want to do something. And so they set up these groups to try to put people to use. And that became the defining feature. So a lot of this is kind of almost being made up, in a kind of ad hoc way as they go along. And that became the one of the defining features. So I think it's very hard to say really what the the modus operandi was, and it is something that it evolved constantly. You had at various points they tried to kind of say this is really what the organization's about, and then the world moved on and the organization moved on, and they had to do something different. I think that's a very good point about. I don't know the memoirs of Stefan Zweig you mentioned, but certainly early on, Amnesty was very concerned that there shouldn't be any trumpeting of success, because they were aware that as soon as they started boasting about it, that they would be in trouble, because these strong leaders don't like being shown to be weak. So I think that's certainly the way that they approached it. And I think throughout really, Amnesty always had this kind of, it's strange you've got about Benenson, who's such a powerful figure, but beyond Benenson, it seems to have almost kind of anti-leadership culture. I think you see that very clearly in when they received the Nobel Peace Prize, and the people who accept the prize are not, as it were, the the actual formal leaders in many cases, that they were definitely trying to present a different image. So they're quite careful about how they present their public image throughout this period, to say, we are an organization of ordinary people, as it were, not just these sort of extraordinary leaders. Okay. In terms of obviously human rights in the state, I mean, again, that's a massive topic, and I think in a way, one reason why I find this period so interesting is it's a period of tremendous change in, you might say, in sensibilities about the relationship between ordinary people and the state, in terms of the level of collaboration with the state that was permissible. I mean, I think the crucial moment is a bit later. It's the Vietnam War, especially in the States, and then you get these tremendous revelations over things like the journal called Encounter, which then was revealed to have been funded by the CIA, and that kind of the Congress of Cultural Freedom and those sorts of things. That was about 1968-9. But in a way, Amnesty, some of the issues I've touched on in the book are of the same sort of, the same sort of issues. How far should you accept state funds, as you say? What is it okay to receive money for? And I think for Benenson, this was very problematic because, he was a member of the elite. Had gone to, absolutely elite schools and colleges. He was on first name terms with senior figures in the elite. And so I think he never quite understood that these people are not the same. They don't have your interests at heart. So when he sets up Amnesty, people like, Harold Macmillan, who was the British Prime Minister at that time, sends a very, very nice letter and thinks it's a marvelous idea and, jolly good sort of thing. And then, when Wilson came in as Prime Minister, the Labour government in 1964 was absolutely full of people who had been in Amnesty. All of the legal team, from the Lord Chancellor down, had all, were all lawyers who had done stuff, were members of Amnesty or whatever. And I do think Benenson, I think he found it very hard to understand that suddenly that could turn against you. And it's when, you begin to get Amnesty challenging over what the British government was doing in Aden, the colony in Arabia, that suddenly things got very nasty, and the British government is suddenly turning on Amnesty. And I think he found that very, very difficult. And obviously after that, Amnesty did find it much less easy to contemplate taking government funds. But I did find in the National Archives, they were asking for government funds within a year or two of this terrible crisis. And I also found, it's in the book, that Benenson had these very strong links to the Information Research Department of the Foreign Office. And I thought that was pretty remarkable that, again, there's a sense that, well, we're all really on the same side. The Foreign Office, they want to help, Christians in Russia, and we want to help Christians in Russia. Therefore, we all work together, and doesn't seem to have understood that you're never going to have the same interests exactly. And that, I think that is a crucial message for human rights organizations. They have to be very careful about, we say supping with the devil, you have to have a long spoon, is a British phrase. I don't know if you have a similar one in Spanish, but you have to be very careful. So I think this, the mid-60s is a time in which conventional ideas about relations with the state are going to be turned on their head, and Amnesty was kind of caught up in that, but survived. It came through, partly because, and this is, obviously Amnesty was increasingly more than just a British organization. It's a weird combination of a kind of British organization, but set in this increasingly kind of international or European framework. So you had this very powerful section in Sweden, in West Germany, as was the Netherlands, and it's really those organizations looked at what was happening in Britain in that big crisis, and scratching their heads and couldn't understand it at all. And they're kind of what kept it, I think, going, really provided the ballast that Amnesty needed at that point. What else have we got? So yeah, obviously about the Spanish Civil War. I mean, I think, absolutely, I like that idea about having a super event. I think they are tremendously important. Although I think it's interesting also with Amnesty that and similar organizations, by the late 50s, early 60s, I mean, the Civil War was quite a long time ago, and you're on to the next round, which is, the organization appealing for an amnesty in Spain was set up to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the end of the Spanish Civil War, and they're still trying to kind of get a bit of mileage out of the Civil War, but also so much had happened since then. Of course, you know that better than I about the abuse of human rights under the Franco regime and political imprisonment, and it was more this sort of focus on attending trials and that kind of thing that Benenson did, and that's really how he got involved, with going to Spain and acting as an observer, which appeared to have some effect in mediating the harm. But it's almost a second generation really from the events of the Civil War, and one does wonder about how far the younger generation actually knew much about the Civil War at that time, because the history was kind of yet to be written. I mean, Hugh Thomas's book came out. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was the first major work on the Spanish Civil War by Hugh Thomas. And in my collection of essays that came out last year, I got an essay about Hugh Thomas and his book, and I make the point that his book was published in the same month as Amnesty being launched, and actually, there is a kind of there's an interesting sort of synergy there as well. People were kind of re-engaging with the Spanish Civil War through his book, which was smuggled into Spain in brown paper covers, because it was banned in Spain. But people did want to know about the Civil War. In terms of abuse of psychiatry, I mean, it's a big topic. I mean, I went into it really because it's something I knew nothing about, and I found it very interesting. I thought it did raise very interesting questions, because obviously, as you're saying, the 60s and especially the 70s were a time of great questioning in the West of psychiatry, which makes it such an interesting time to to be looking over the wall, as it were, and seeing the abuse of psychiatry. I don't have much. I mean, in a way, it's a while since I looked at that, so I haven't got anything sort of front of mind. Certainly, a lot of the activists at that time were doctors. But having said that, I mean, I'm a bit wary of saying, doctors are inherently activists, because a lot of these professions in the 60s, certainly in the 60s, less so in the 70s, but in the 60s, were very conservative. And so we know the radicals, because they stand out. But I mean, the legal profession, I mean, Benenson, the reason he didn't kind of run with the legal profession was because he said they're so conservative, they don't want to change anything, so, he'd set up this organization called Justice, aimed at lawyers. I mean, it's still there today. I mean, it's doing a decent job, but it's not a mass movement. It's not a, and so Benenson, decided that to achieve something, he had set up a proper mass movement, hence Amnesty International. And, lawyers at that time, like doctors broadly, were seen as part of the establishment. I think that's changed a lot in Britain. Certainly, I don't know about other countries, but certainly in the 1980s, especially in response to Thatcherism, because Thatcher and her assault on the post-war order antagonized a lot of those professional groups, and that was a great sort of change of direction in Britain. The question about the victim and the perpetrator is a very good one, and the question about victims of terrorism and so on. I mean, in the book, I did mention the way that Amnesty had its own sort of internal debate about what to do about Nelson Mandela in 1964, and that was a very interesting moment, because a lot of people in Amnesty, although he had advocated the use of violence, they wanted to make a special case, and Amnesty held the line on that. And I think probably correctly, because I think if you start making special cases over the use of violence, I'm not sure where it stops. And they came under pressure over German groups wanting to adopt Baader-Meinhof terrorists in the 1970s. And, I think then Amnesty was able to turn around and say, look, this is our position. We even didn't make Nelson Mandela a prisoner of conscience, So, and the final thing, the future of human rights. I mean, I suppose I sort of touched on that a bit in my comments at the end, because, I started work on this at a time when it seemed that human rights were really on the up. in the 1990s, and then the historians got really interested, you know, in the 2000s, and it became this incredibly sort of, you know, widely talked about subject. And now, you know, imperceptibly the wind changes, and you start getting very abhorrent situations of the kind that we're all familiar with. And so today, you know, it looks very, very different. So I suppose what I don't really, you know, I'm not a crystal ball gazer, but you know, when I suppose the lesson I took from my research was that ultimately, you know, activism and more, you might say, legal or institutional reforms, you know, move broadly together. You know, they need each other. You know, the activists kind of need to be able to put the pressure for change. The lawyers and others need to be able to consolidate that and work in a kind of institutional framework. And I think, you know, with the lawyers perhaps in retreat, you know, one thinks about, you know, the current USA, when even the, you know, the Constitution appears to be somehow, you know, less reliable, less resilient than it was. You know, it's it's a bad time for those sort of legal advocates. In Britain, one thinks about people, even today, I've heard, you know, senior politicians talking about, you know, Britain leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. That's kind of coming around again and again, and it's kind of rising further and further up the, you know, the agenda. So I think it is a time, as I said at the end, really, of my comments, where I think the ball will be in future in the activist court, at least for a while. It's the activists who need to get active, you know, and start putting pressure on these regimes to change their ways. And, you know, in a sense, we are, you know, things go in cycles, and we're back to that point in the cycle. But I'm not totally gloomy, I have to say. So, okay. So thanks very much for those questions.
Yeah, thanks to you for the answers. And Daniel, should we open the floor? Microphone.
Yeah, now if you have finished, we can go to the question time. And Pablo has raised his hand, so Pablo, yeah, you can speak.
You can put the camera.
Hello, thank you very much. Yeah, unfortunately, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah. We can hear you. Yeah.
I would like to apologize because my internet connection is not working very well at the moment. So if that's okay, I will keep my camera off.
Yep.
Okay.
But I would like to thank you both, Tom and Nicolas, very much for a fascinating presentation and talk and sort of dialogue. And I have sort of half a question, half a comment. I'm really in agreement with you when you say we need to avoid these back projections for the post-war years in Europe, and how some of the narratives of the 1960s and the 1970s have been imposed to the 1940s and the 1950s. And in that vein, I had a question about the very notion of amnesty. And it's, to me, this is a term that I'm very intrigued by. Why was it used, right? Why did they name this organization Amnesty? And because what I study is also the far right after 1945, right? And especially the second half of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, and their amnesty has a particular meaning, right?
Yeah.
So this is the time that the far right is actually campaigning all over Europe for amnesty for war criminals. And actually, the notion of amnesty law is very much linked to forgiveness, reintegration of fascists, of collaborationists, and in some segments of society is actually is seen as a very critical instance, right? So it's a problematic term in a way. So I was wondering, when does this change, right?
Yeah.
When is the moment in which public perception about the very notion of amnesty and also in connection to the notion of human rights happens, right? Because, for instance, it's very famous, and Nicolas knows this better than I do, right? So one of the mottos of the left during the transition is amnesty and freedom, right? But of course, in the 1940s, the very notion of amnesty is a different one, right? So Paul van Zeeland, this Christian Committee for the Defense, or the Committee for the Defense of Christian Civilization, they marched to Lourdes in the 1940s is asking for forgiveness for collaborationists in France, right? Asking for amnesty for these people. I was wondering if you could say something more about the word amnesty and the perception and how it changes. Thank you very much again for fascinating talk.
Thank you. Well, it's a great question, and I don't know. I can't, pin down exactly how that happened, but broadly, I mean, when Benenson had this idea, it wasn't immediately clear what this new, if it was going to be a movement or whatever, would be called. In fact, the first idea he had was actually armistice. Okay, it was going to be called armistice because it was going to be an armistice in the Cold War, and he had this idea that he could be like at a clap of his hands, as it were, the guns would fall silent in the Cold War and all the prisoners would appear. I mean, that was almost like a kind of visionary idea that he had. Now, at some point, they dropped armistice. It's said, I mean, someone said it was because originally the campaign was going to end on the 11th of November, and that would clash with the armistice from the First World War, and the British Legion didn't like it, or something like that. I mean, I don't know. These are just hinted at in oral history interviews. But soon after that, he did adopt this term amnesty. But I think there's a deeper issue to that, which is I've already touched on, that from 59 onwards, you had this appeal for an amnesty in Spain, which was broadly a kind of popular frontist movement, not just in Britain but around Europe, for amnesty for political prisoners in Spain to mark the end, the 20th anniversary of the outbreak of the Civil War. And that had become, reasonably successful in Britain, very heavily promoted on the left. So I think a lot of people in Britain would have been familiar with that. There were also other amnesty organisations. There was one for Portugal and one for Greece. So that term was kind of around at that time, and Benenson was not involved in that movement because of the the divide between Labour, you might say Social Democrat and Communist, and he was very disapproving of these movements and said that really they were they were communist movements and weren't to be touched. I mean, he set up the Labour Party had its own organisation called the Spanish Democrats Defence Fund, which he was very involved in, and eventually I do see amnesty, then his adoption of that term amnesty, almost as a way of seizing control of that word from the further left. And ultimately he succeeded, of course, because these other organizations kind of went out of business in the end, partly because of political change in Spain and Portugal and so on in the early 70s. But I think also it was one of the things he says, if you look at that statement that launched, where he launched amnesty with a newspaper article in the Observer Weekend Review of the 28th of May 1961. You can look at it online, and he does mention there the failure of other amnesty organizations that focus on a particular country. And he says, no, we've got to do this. It's got to be universal. It's got to be global. That was, for me, that's where the genius bit comes in. That's the genius, is to kind of say it's going to be a global organization, and it's not going to be a traditional sort of thing where people on the left say we've got to get left-wingers out of jail in Spain, or people on the right say they want to get right-wing prisoners out of jail in Hungary or something, in some other right-wing dictatorship. So it's kind of it's a combination of things, and it's very hard to pin it down exactly because we just don't have that level of internal information, to say, well, this is exactly what it was. That'd be my explanation of what happened. I don't know if Nicholas, you might have anything to add on that.
No, just I remember the 𝗵𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵𝐻 𝗵𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵𝐻, the wife of the political prisoner, became very upset with this notion of Benenson not focusing on one country and one particular figure, but much more global understanding of what the organization should be like. And that was interesting. You know how it ended with the 𝗵𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵𝐻 and Benenson, the relationship were.
How that relationship turned out, I don't know. But 𝗵𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵𝐻 went back to jail soon. He was released in the early 60s and then went back to jail during the Colonel's coup, I think. So it was quite difficult. I don't know what happened with her.
Okay, José Aguilar, you have your raise hand so you can speak. Thank you, José.
El micro, José.
The micro.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So thank you very much, Tom and Nicolás for this wonderful conversation. I have to apologize because I haven't read the book yet, but I promise to read it after this conversation. I have two questions. One is more, let's say, a curiosity that might be a bit of an off topic from the topics you touch upon your book. But as you mentioned at the beginning, Samuel Moyn, it reminded me of one of his early books about Christian human rights, where he put that the first person who ever theorized or mentioned the phrase in human rights was actually a historian, was the West German historian Gerhard Ritter. So I was wondering about the intellectual theorization in the British context of human rights and who carried that out. So where is something particular to historians that could make them like more prone to go in that direction? That would be one question. And the second is regarding something you also touch upon, but did not develop, of course, because it was a short presentation, which is about the colonial thing and related to Eastern Europe, because you mentioned something about Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe in the history of human rights is always like the bad guy of the picture, as it is put that human rights were weaponized against them by the armed dissidents and the Charter 77 and so on and so forth. But there is a kind of a recent line of research that is putting how actually Eastern Europe also leveraged human rights, and they did it particularly in the context of decolonization, which they pretty much put forward because they had reasons for Cold War kind of geopolitical reasons to do so. And as you mentioned Namibia, I was wondering whether there would be kind of a certain alignment between this human rights activist in Britain and someone from Eastern Europe, because the case of Namibia is interesting because it was a former German colony, and the East Germans were very vocal and very adamant about putting forward a program to decolonization of Namibia that had a strong resonance even in the United Nations. So I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on that. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, I think the question about you might say language, the theory of human rights, it's kind of complicated in Britain, because obviously in France, you have the that whole idea that droit de l'homme and everything is has a long ancestry, which we didn't have in Britain. And in Britain, you had far more of this language of civil liberties, and so that the book starts really with this organization, the National Council for Civil Liberties, in the 1930s. It was set up at the time of unemployment and the rise of fascism and that kind of thing. And I think the problem was that, I mean, people didn't really know what's the difference between civil liberties and human rights, because some people would kind of come along and say, well, they're the same thing, and then other people felt really strongly they were different. I mean, civil liberties in the British context implies a much more kind of national politics, you might say. It's to do with the radical politics in Britain, has struggled with the state and that kind of thing. And by contrast, people didn't really know, what did human rights mean? Even in the early 1940s, it was still that concept was at an early stage, I would say, in Britain of contestation. I mean, in 1940, there was this famous newspaper, a series of newspaper columns about setting up, trying to define the future based on human rights. What would be it was set up by the writer H.G. Wells. What would be a kind of menu of human rights that would be a kind of war aim for the British to work towards. And so, throughout the war, you have these different documents, like the Atlantic Charter, the UN Charter, and so on. And these ideas were being discussed increasingly, but it's very much a kind of it's a work in progress, I would say, during the Second World War, and begins to emerge after the Second World War as much more. That's why the UN Charter of 1948 is so important, because finally we have a document setting out an agreed set of values and very specific human rights for the first time. from an international body. So it's quite a kind of complex period. I didn't want to spend too much time in the book on that, because that's really what I'm mainly interested in is not the ideas, but how people responded and what they did, what they did on the ground. But you'll find in the book I have to go into some detail on this early phase of discussion. In terms of the colonies in Eastern Europe, I mean that's very interesting. I haven't come across that. I suspect it's probably more to do with the 1970s, from what you're saying. Certainly Namibia remains under colonial control by the South Africans until the late 80s, I think, which would fit with East Germany. So I'm not sure about that. Yeah, so I can't really give a clear anything, as a clear answer on the East German point, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Have you got any further question?
Pablo, César, have to practice your English. Don't be shy.
If not, I have a little bit one, but maybe that requires a big explication. Because the 60s and the 70s, they're circulating another kind of internationalisms. I'm thinking about, for example, the anti-colonial struggles, third worldism, or anti-imperialism. But nowadays, anti-imperialism is like, or sounds like something old-fashioned. And very few times we understand the conflicts in these terms. But we usually use this kind of human rights dialogue, human rights justification. How do you can explain this failure of the anti-imperialist internationalism? And on the other hand, how do you explain the success of this humanitarian internationalism during the 70s and especially during the 80s?
Can you say a bit more about why you think anti-imperialism failed? What do you have in mind when you say that?
I have in my mind the Vietnam War and maybe from that radical politics and the young politics regarding the anti-imperialism, internationalism, and that was very strong among the left politics, European left politics. But after that, after the 70s, after the finish of the Vietnam War, Laos, Cambodia finished and tends to disappear and was replaced even in left politics by this kind of humanitarian language. So my question is, how can we can understand this failure and this success of this humanitarian internationalism?
Interesting. Certainly in the British context, of course, I mean, decolonization happened very quickly, in the late 50s and the early 60s. I mean, the British Empire, which had been quite a thriving entity, until the mid 50s, then really sort of changes very, very quickly. And we move into a period by the early 60s, by the time of Amnesty being set up, really, the empire is very quickly draining away. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind, that you suddenly have a generation of people coming to the fore who had known empire, but actually now really see empire as being quite distant. And I think again, it's partly this question of perspective. Looking back now, we tend to see empire everywhere, but at the time, the people like Harold Wilson and people like that, saw the success, the decline of empire as a success, something successfully accomplished. Very interested in the Commonwealth. I mean, as I said, I'm working on Wilson at the moment, and it's very interesting how his biggest concern about Britain's entry into the European Economic Community is, well, what about all these people in the Commonwealth and our trade with them? It's absolutely top of his agenda. So people's sort of mindset was very different. Now, anti-imperialism, I suppose, is slightly different. I mean, it's like saying, you know, you've got the Americans imposing an order on Vietnam, and certainly you're right. I mean, that was a massive cause in Britain and Germany and France and so on, as well as in the States itself in the late 60s and early 70s. I'm not quite sure what, you know, if we look at the late 70s, what took its place? You know, I mean, what were the big what would we look for? You know, in a sense, I think those sorts of big conflicts are less visible in the late 70s. You know, there was a bit of a kind of hiatus, I think, internationally. But I mean, certainly one thinks about the 1980s. I mean, anti-imperialism's still there, isn't it? You've got El Salvador and Nicaragua and all of those things. It's not gone away. I mean, I was actually in Nicaragua in 1983. You know, so where are a lot of the East Germans, by the way. So it all connects. You know, it seemed pretty real to me at that time. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily accept that there is a complete switch around taking place. Actually, I'd have to think about that more, though. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but anti-imperialism was more displaced maybe by the social democrat governments of Southern Europe, just precisely because they got the memory from their own fights against dictatorship. So maybe we can shift to a more transatlantic, but not just to the US, but to Central and Latin America in general, from southern countries in Europe. Then we're not the only one crossing the Atlantic, because the far right activists and strategists did the same. That's one of the main points of maybe understanding this global logic.
Sorry, I've made a note. Is it Pablo who asked about amnesty and the term amnesty? Because the other thing I was going to say about that is that Amnesty was very aware that there was this different interpretation in European countries. And I remember Benenson said to me when I met him that he had got off the station in Lyon and had seen a sign saying "Vive l'Amnesty," and for a moment thought, wow, this is great. My organization is being, you know, there's graffiti in Lyon. And he suddenly realized it was for an amnesty for the, I think it was the secret army, you know, OAS.
Yeah,
or something like
OAS.
that. And, yeah, or like, and I did also find that in, I think it was in Belgium, you had people infiltrate, when they tried to set up an Amnesty International there, people kind of infiltrated it to pursue that agenda of amnesty for people who have been, you know, found guilty of collaboration during the Second World War, you know, stripped of citizen rights or whatever. And so it was something they had to be very concerned about, you know, to make sure that this new organization wasn't sort of taken over by people with a different agenda. And it does make the choice of title, you know, perhaps rather ignorant on, you know.
No, but in France, there was indeed a double understanding of the amnesty war, because there was a movement for the amnesty of torture during the decolonization war in Algeria. And they did pass an amnesty law in the late 60s for that did amnesty all the crimes and all the tortures committed in the fight against independence in Algeria. So the war amnesty got is a very ambivalent war in France. And there was also, if I'm not wrong, another amnesty campaign when the trials against Maurice Papon and the other former functionaries of the Vichy administration were starting to get trial in France in late 80s. So there was actually a good point how the same word can mean something and yet the opposite.
That's right.
So anyone has any question or any comment?
So we're pretty much done.
Okay, sounds good.
So, but thanks again, Tom. It was a privilege to hearing you this afternoon, and thanks everyone for coming. And we will launch the program for next year seminar probably in late September. So we have plenty of time to continue with our own research and publishing new books that will be presented in this seminar again.
Well, good luck with that, and thanks for inviting me. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye.
for coming.
Have a
Bye.
nice evening. Bye.